Okay, now it says I'm live. I decided to start it live before I invited Chip. So now I'm going to invite Chip. And let's see what happens. Well, there's Chip.
I can hear you.
Okay, now it says we're live.
It does.
Do you want to double check on that? Or would you, please?
I am checking right now.
Thank you so much.
It says I see you live. We got 5 people watching.
Okay, that's great. Now, the only thing I have to be able to do is to try to monitor the live, let's see, for the top chat. That's going to be my one crippling. Here we go. I'll see if I can bring it up on my phone, keep the volume down, and then I can monitor the top chat.
So, all right. I'm going to share.
Here we go. Okay. So yeah, please do. Chip's going to try a screen share. There you are. That's wonderful. Okay, it looks like we've got everything where it's going to be working now. And my sincerest apologies. YouTube has changed some things, and I used to do live streaming more often, maybe a year or so ago, but you forget things, and they don't really tend to make things easier to use as time goes by. So the way that this works is that about 2.5 weeks ago today, I made a quick video and I told everybody there was some things that I was going to be doing. One of the things that was going to be upcoming was a presentation that Chip had worked very hard on concerning Fomenko's parameter D. And we had scheduled that for the following Sunday. That would have been 2 weeks ago tomorrow. And what happened was I woke up that Sunday with hand, foot, and mouth disease that I got from my son, and it was probably the worst sickness I've ever had in my life that I can remember, anyways. So that really put me out of circulation for a while, and so now we're doing that today. And I want to thank Chip again for joining me. And real quick, I just want to tell everybody a little bit about him. That Chip's an engineer and a mathematician turned software developer with strong interests in physics, history, and astronomical dating, music, and ancient text. Having released production software in a half dozen languages and more than 20 dialects, he found that human languages have a similar applicable syntax. While all of the chaos theory papers from Russia could not convince him to learn Russian, A.T. Fomenko's untranslated works did. This inevitably led to Scaliger and the need to understand Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic. He's currently working on translating De Amendation Temporum into English to allow researchers denying Scaliger to point to the exact pages where he got it wrong. So I imagine that would be guys like Jacob Duhlman. I will be posting a link to his current progress in the description, as well as a link to the presentation that he's going to be now doing. As a matter of fact, Chip, is there any way for you to actually paste that link into the top chat of the video, the live stream right now?
Yeah, I can.
That would be wonderful. And then anybody can just click on that and watch along with you as you do this, because really Chip's going to be doing most of the talking. I went over his presentation a few times, and considering what background I have in this, which isn't extensive, it's mostly in the context of Fomenko. I came up with what questions I could that I thought were relatively appropriate questions that let's say a layman like myself, might answer. But again, that's what the chat is for, and hopefully, I'll be able to spot some good questions. So, Chip, is that link in?
It won't let me post a link into the chat.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, let's see.
So
If
that's
I,
what it is. You just need to add HTTPS before.
yeah, let me see if it'll let me do it.
And it won't even let me put the HTTPS in.
No kidding. Okay. All right. I've actually got it on my phone here. So let me see. I'm going to bring it up on here, and maybe it will let me copy from here. Here we go. And I'll bring back up the video. There you go. Link is in the chat. So, yeah. All right. Now, without any further ado, Chip, if you want to start the first portion of your presentation, I can't wait.
All right, I'll start sharing the screen. Okay, it should be sharing the screen. There we go.
It is.
All right, so to start off, Fomenko's Lunarium Part 1, the strange leap of the parameter d double prime in the theory of lunar motion. So it all started when I found this green meteorite. I read in Faraday's Book of the Comics. Oh, sorry, wrong start. It all started when Fomenko read a controversial 1972 article by Robert Newton. The link below right there. And basically, this paper talks about how non-gravitational forces affected the moon's orbit in order to match up with the historical dating of eclipses. Fomenko figured that it could be a data issue, and he thought on it for a while. So from 1972 and finally in 1980, 8 years later, he published the paper on the calculations of the second derivative of lunar elongation, the problems and mechanics of navigated moments, hierarchical systems. So this presentation summarizes the information that's available in the astronomy versus history, available at the following link below. So a little bit of background in order to understand this is the Julian period. The Julian period was invented by Scaliger as a common timeline to hold all other identified timelines. It uses the same months as the Roman Julian calendar and the Gregorian calendar. The Julian date, or JD, is based upon the number of days since Monday, 4713 BC, January 1st. One of the advantages of this method is you can take the modulus of the day count by 7, and it gives you the weekday. So 0 being Monday, 1 being Tuesday, etc. And the Julian year consists of exactly 365.25 days. Some of the tools that I use in order to convert between the Julian period dates and the Gregorian dates is something by the Navy. So the only difference between the two calendars is the number of leap years. The Gregorian calendar has 3 less leap years every 400 years due to the leap year rule. The Gregorian calendar does not have a leap day in years divisible by 100 unless it is also divisible by 400. And below is the link for the online Julian date calendar. And the average Gregorian year length is 365.2425 days. One of the other tools that I use is called JS Orrery, and it's an open source orrery written in JavaScript, and it's available at the following link at GitHub. The application's latest version can be viewed at http://orrery.com, and that will redirect you to a github.io link, and that's where it's currently based. Now, this program uses the EPL82b algorithm to model the lunar orbit. It also uses Gregorian dates, so approximately 3 days are added for every 400 years from a Julian calendar date before 1582, starting with the offset of -11. The time of the day is not affected. The claimed accuracy is within 15 seconds per 500 years before 500 AD. So at 1 BC, we're looking at 15 seconds, 500 BC, an error of 30 seconds, and 1000 BC an error of 45 seconds. Another one is the actual NASA eclipse catalogs. So it uses a slightly updated algorithm, ELP 2000/82, which includes a larger set of confirmed observations. The solar eclipse catalog is at the below link, and the lunar eclipse catalog, again, the link is just below that. It has really good accuracy with recent data. There's a delta T in past times is added to make the ancient eclipses agree. And at 500 BC, the offset is around 17,190 seconds, which is approximately 4 hours and 45 minutes. There is a short-term periodic variation in the lunar cycle. So the lunar cycle has a synodic month, which is approximately 29 days and X hours each lunation. The longest cycle occurs when the moon is moving slowest at its apogee and the Earth is moving its fastest at its perihelion. The shortest cycle is when the moon is moving fastest at its perigee and the Earth is moving slowest, it's at aphelion. And the average over 2,277 lunations is 29.53059 days. And this information was taken from the below link, which is being covered right now, it looks like. Nope. Okay, so individual Toronto, California, Canada, Calendis Lunar Index. So this picture here shows when a lunar eclipse can actually occur. If we have a look at the lower left-hand corner and the upper right-hand corner, we can see that the moon is directly in between the sun and the Earth. And these are the only times when you can get an eclipse of the sun. At the upper left-hand corner and the lower right-hand corner, we see that the moon is actually passing below the ecliptic, and therefore there's a direct path of light. Now, this lunar orbit stays pretty much the same as it goes around, and it turns a little bit in order to have the eclipses make its journey around pretty much the year. So taking a closer look at the short-term periodic variations, we can see the variations over the 2,277 lunations is expanded, and each one of these dots represents when the synodic month occurs. When the synodic month occurs inside and crosses the ecliptic, that's when there'll be an eclipse. This usually happens twice a year, possibly sometimes 3 times, because the 11-day difference between the lunar year and the solar year. Now, the most common offset between lunations is plus or minus 3 hours. And if you look at this graph, you can see that it does appear to have a positive bias. And it really does, and it indicates that the Earth's decrease in eccentricity as its orbit becomes more circular. It is unknown if this is part of a longer cycle. It could reverse itself over periods greater than 44,000 years. And more information, again, is available at the link at the bottom of the page. And so the parameter D double prime is the lunar elongation. So back in that picture, when the moon's orbit is in eclipse, what this is saying is that the eclipse changes its shape. And so it started off pretty much with no acceleration in one direction and became more elongated as it travels up part of this graph. When it gets to about 500 AD, it suddenly changes course and the moon's orbit switches to the other side. So instead of being elongated in one direction, say the X direction, it's now being elongated in the Y direction over the period between 500 to 1000 AD. And then it picks back up where it was and starts going back to a more circular orbit. This solution fits the eclipses in the Scaliger-Petavius timeline. The D double prime parameter from AT Fomenko's solution basically holds the D double prime parameter constant at its 1000 to 1900 AD levels. He found that all of the historical recorded eclipses can be accurately placed after 500 AD when you do this. And the distribution of these eclipses becomes more even. And so if you'll note that these eclipses represent the short-term periodic cycles that coincide with the lunar orbit crossing the ecliptic. Values in the plus or minus 3 range will repeat at a similar place on the same calendar date with a weekday offset of 2 or 3 every 912 years. And so if it's actually a Julian year, it's exactly those years. If you use Gregorian years, you need to move off 2 or 3 days in the calendar, but the weekday offset itself will be the same. So if it occurred on a Tuesday, 912 years later, it'll occur on a Thursday or a Friday, depending on how many orbits it actually takes. So outside this range, they do occur in a different location on the same calendar date. So following A.T. Fomenko's paper, NASA started working on a new eclipse equation, and in 1982 released the EPL82 algorithm. Now, I'm not saying this is due directly to Fomenko's paper, but there is talk that Fomenko and Newton were in communication and exchanged letters about this phenomenon. This equation uses only confirmed sightings of the moon from the 17th century onwards. The algorithm is trained from those data points. And the D double prime is constant in this algorithm, but it does add a delta T of around 2 milliseconds per day, which represents the slowing of the Earth's rotation. And the consequences of this new algorithm. So many ancient eclipses no longer occur at their assigned Scaliger-Petavius location. The periodicity of the algorithm shows a very strong 912-year cycle, plus or minus 1 Enneadecateroid, which is just a 19-year cycle. Adding or subtracting the 18-year Soros cycle of eclipses will also move the eclipse by 11 days and 8 hours. And it moves the latitude up or down depending on the direction chosen. So this means if you're watching an eclipse and you can move it by that 912 years, and that eclipse is suddenly above where it needs to be for an eclipse to occur, you can move it by that Soros cycle in one direction or the other, and it will actually pull that lunar eclipse down so it isn't actually then crossing the ecliptic, causing the eclipse. So many of the ancient eclipses that still match the new EPL82 algorithm also match the string of eclipses 912 or 1824 years later. And most of them will match if you then play around with the Enneadecateroids and the Soros cycles. And that's the end of section 1. Questions?
Yeah. Oh, we're getting delay. Maybe it's just because of the screen share. Now it's gone. Okay. Yeah. Let's see. I checked chat. I haven't seen any questions. I told you I had some questions. Now I'm not surprised, because this material, it's very meticulous and it's very intellectual, and you're definitely a specialist that is going to go into these matters in far, far greater detail than even those of us who do other forms of research. The form of research I do is very, very different. I've just always been very intrigued in this idea of added history because of maybe for the same reason in a lot of people, because there's a lot about history, especially from the time of Christ as it's told. It just didn't feel right. There was just these large swaths of time when everything seemed so abstract and detached. And maybe that's the same reason why a lot of people feel that way too. Now, Flat Fact is asking, was the legal calendar change by the British Parliament taken into account? He says 1750 legal in Britain, 1752 in America, 11 days removed from September. January and February moved to the beginning of the year.
All
Do you
right.
know what he's talking about there, Chip?
So in 1582, the Catholic Church adopted the new Gregorian calendar. And at that point, they did move the calendar forward 11 days. When Britain actually changed their calendar over, they had to move forward 14 days, being a couple centuries later. And I believe it was closer to 1782 when they did it. Maybe it's 1752, and America shortly after that.
Okay. All right. Let me ask you one of mine while I'm waiting. Maybe some more questions will come up. Okay, so Newton's theory puts the moon at the same synodic period, but with a distinctly different elliptic or shape at its rotation. Is this correct?
Newton's equation?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, Newton's equation with the dynamic elongation basically starts it off where the ecliptic would be if you have the Earth in the center and the moon here, it's actually changing the orbit to suddenly be sideways like this, and then it's going back to be circular. And all throughout the 70s, many scientists had a problem with this actual explanation.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
that's where they basically, I think, came up and decided they needed to start working on the new algorithm with the EPL 82.
EPL 82. Yeah. Yeah, because I mean that begs the question that if that model in Newton's theory was correct, you would think that scores of astronomers and or chronologists would have noted such a change in even the speed of the moon in the sky, or its clear enlargement or shrinking depending on its position. Um, it would seem to me that if that even held any water, that there would be scores of records citing this strange variation in movement of the moon, because it seems to me that that would be something that would be easily notable by those who have watched the heavens for time immemorial. Is that not correct also?
There would definitely be somebody noticing difference, but it is also during what we consider the Dark Ages. And very little of the information has survived from that period, if it happened at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, outside of the anomalies like comets and the like, uh, are there any records that you know of wherein any historian or astronomer noted any distinct change in the speed or synchronicity of any heavenly bodies?
I do not know of any documents that survive to our day.
Okay. Um, well, all right. So at the end of this, trying to understand I didn't write it down. It was the EL what 82?
The EPL 82 algorithm.
EPL 82 algorithm. Now you said that what they got the EPL 82 algorithm to do was to basically agree with all the movements of the heavenly bodies, or at least eclipses, from the 17th century onward, right?
It's verified sightings of the moon. It didn't have to be an eclipse because we're just modeling how the moon moves, but
Okay.
it uses from the 17th century reliable sightings of the moon all the way up to the present day, and it used that in order to fit the algorithm.
Okay. And then if I understand this correctly, what you're saying is, with their new solution now to the problem with Newton's paper back in the 70s, with this new solution, what that does is it opens up this possibility of a shift in these eclipses, either 912 or 1824 years, as far as events recorded. That there is, if I understood it right, that there is sort of now in front of us this possibility of a very big time shift of either 912 or 1824 years. Is that correct?
It does seem to be that if you play around with the algorithm and you find an eclipse, you can add the 912 years, Julian years. So in JS Orrery, we do need to add a couple of extra days or subtract a couple of extra days in order to get to the eclipse.
Yeah.
And you'll see that that same eclipse occurs. So it just repeats the cycle at around those 3 great Metonic years. So
Okay.
a Metonic year's great Metonic year is 304 years. And so 3 of those cycles equals the 912 years where things do seem to repeat very well.
Okay. Well, would you say that whether or not anyone agrees with Fomenko or guys like Illig or Scott or you or I or anyone, is it safe to say that the present date assumed or years since Christ assumed needs serious revision?
They're astronomically,
Yeah.
many of those eclipses do not fall into the right place anymore. Now, some of those could be because the interpretation was incorrect as far as whether it really was an eclipse. Other ones just basically say it needed to be a full eclipse and it was only an annular eclipse. So anytime when they say that the stars came out, you really need a complete eclipse in order for the stars to come out. If you have, above 95%, you might be able to see Venus and Mars. But beyond that, to see those stars, you really need to be fully eclipsed.
Yeah. And, I know this is another whole can of worms, but it does seem to be applicable. Um, if this whole thing can change as far as, let's say, geographically, something was assumed to have taken place at one place geographically, but it took place at another area geographically. That would actually change the look of both solar and lunar eclipses. Is that not correct?
The lunar eclipse, as long as you can see it, would be the same because that's just as long as you can see the moon, you can see where the eclipse occurred. With
Okay.
the solar eclipse, it is a very narrow path that is in the full eclipse.
So you have
Outside of
to,
that, you'll get a partial eclipse, and the further away, the less of the eclipse that you will see.
right. So you have to be at a very particular place to witness a solar eclipse in a certain way. Because I know Fomenko does spend a little bit of time in his first book, Chronology 1, talking about eclipses, and there is an ecliptical path of a solar eclipse, and you definitely really need to be in the place you said you were when you witnessed a certain eclipse.
For solar eclipses, that is absolutely true.
Okay. I mean, so it really whittles down where you can be when you say that you witnessed a certain eclipse then. Okay. Um, All right. So I don't have any additional questions on that portion of it. So if you'd like, please proceed with part 2.
All right, I'll proceed. All right, so Fomenko's Lunarium, Part 2, the dating of the Peloponnesian triad of eclipses. So Thucydides was an eyewitness to the Peloponnesian War. He was a general and a historian who wrote everything he saw during that war. The first eclipse is described in Thucydides 2:28. And the translation I gave this was, and this summer's new moon of the month, the sun was eclipsed after midday and was once again replaced by a newborn crescent, and the stars themselves shined. Now, some of the other translations that I've seen say that tenun means some, but I haven't been able to clarify that. If anybody does know about that, let me know. The second eclipse occurred 7 years later. And in Thucydides 4:52, it says, and occurring the very next summer, the sun was half eclipsed by the new moon. Other translations I've seen that is the very first month of summer, there was a partial eclipse. And the third eclipse, which was a lunar eclipse, my translation of Thucydides 750 is, as destiny would have it, as they set sail, the moon was eclipsed during the actual full moon. And so Thucydides eclipsed triad conditions. First one is all three eclipses were observed from the area longitude 15 to 30 and latitude 30 to 42 degrees. The first eclipse is solar. The second eclipse is solar. The third eclipse is lunar. The time interval between the first two eclipses is 7 years. The interval between the second eclipse and the third eclipse is 11 years. The first eclipse occurs in summer. The first solar eclipse is a total eclipse since one can see the stars. The first solar eclipse occurs after midday local time. The second solar eclipse occurs in the beginning of summer. The third lunar eclipse placed around the end of summer when they set sail. And the last one they had in here is the second solar eclipse occurs within the vicinity of March. Now, in their paper, it states that it can be ignored, basically because the only solutions they found forced it to be there. But the translations mention it occurred the following summer. So I'm not sure where March came from, as March is not the beginning of summer, but the beginning of spring. So Dionysius Petavius came up with a solution, kind of overriding what Scaliger had originally thought and moving it by a couple years. And so the first eclipse occurred on the 3rd of August, 431 BC. The second eclipse occurred on the 21st of March at 424 BC, and the lunar eclipse on the 27th of August, 413 BC. And so if we were to look at what these look like, I do want to go. So this is what NASA says that first eclipse looked like. And if we were to zoom in, we can see that nowhere in Greece or Thracia or Peloponnesian was it total. If he was actually in Thracia, he would see a 90% obscuration, but that's really unlikely to bring out the stars. Anywhere further away is even less. And it was also an annular solar eclipse, meaning that the shadow of the moon did not touch the Earth. If we look at the orrery, we can actually play what this looks like. And so from this position here, which is basically in Athens, if we hit play, we can see that the moon kind of comes across and it's a pretty decent eclipse, but it's definitely not a full solar eclipse. With the second, there was an eclipse, and being partial, it makes perfect sense that the eclipse coming down here would be seen from Greece. Looking at that in the orrery, we can see that about half the sun was definitely eclipsed. With the actual lunar eclipse, we had a total lunar eclipse at that time. And again, looking at the orrery, we can watch the Earth go across the sun. Clean up those windows, back to here. And so what does this mean? There's heated discussions on Petavius' solution. The main problems with the dating is the first eclipse. The solar eclipse of the 3rd of August, 431, was annular, so it couldn't have been total anywhere on Earth. Thucydides explicitly tells us the stars were visible during the eclipse. Petavius and his source, Kepler's optics, incorrectly calculate the phase of this moon. And historically, this has become known as the Thucydides triad problem. Now, why is it so important? Is the Spartans engaged in military maneuvers during the Olympics truce, allegedly in the first year of the 79th Olympiad, which is the Athens Olympics. And that's 316 years after the first Olympic Games. Thucydides' triad of eclipses is the main piece of chronological evidence that ties the start of the Olympic Games and all of the calendars that reference the Olympiad to 776 BC. Multiple accounts of the Olympics demonstrate that it continued for at least 400 years. Pliny the Elder and the Natural History, we know at least 376 years. And uncorroborated references show that it could have continued up for another 752 years after Thucydides. So the Scaliger-Petavius placement of the Olympiad in the Julian period gives us a look like this. So the Exodus occurring 1450 BC. In the brackets there, Colin Humphreys has come up with a very convincing eclipse that shows it probably happened at 1207 BC. But then the start of the Olympiad period starts at 776 BC. Xerxes was in power at 485 BC. 449 BC is when the truth violation occurred. 400 years later or so, we have Caesar assassinated in 44 BC. We switch to the Common Era. Constantinople founded in 306 AD. And the last reference to an Olympiad was 393 AD. And of course, today being 2018. And that Julian date is off by 2 weeks. So Morozov's solution. Morozov is a Russian scientist around the turn of the 20th century. He, first of all, was the one to question a lot of the actual history that came down to us. He found a different solution to the triad problem. And his first one is August the 2nd, 1133 AD. The second eclipse occurring at the 20th of March in 1140 AD. And the final eclipse occurring on the 28th of August, 1151 AD. With his eclipse, it definitely goes over the period. Goes right over Greece. If he was in Thracia, he definitely would have seen it. And anywhere pretty much in Greece, including Athens, if you're a little bit north of it at least, you would definitely see a total eclipse. Looking at the orrery, we can watch as it passes over, and that is definitely a total eclipse over Greece. The second eclipse went through Northern Europe, and from Greece, we can see that it covered about half of the sun. Looking at our orrery, we can watch this. And the orrery, with its equation, definitely puts it a little less coverage than what NASA does with its revised equations. And finally, the total eclipse would have been a very partial eclipse that occurred in 1151. Whereas looking at this from the orrery, we can watch it go across, and it barely eclipses it, but it looks like you would count that as a lunar eclipse. So the effects that this would have on the timeline is a shift of almost 1563 years. That means that with the references we have tying the ancient Olympiad to the Exodus would have occurred in 112 AD. Again, I said there's pretty convincing eclipse back in 1207 BC to match with the time when the sun didn't set for a full day. The Olympiad itself would start in 788 AD. Xerxes would have been in power in 1079 AD. The truth violation occurring 1148 AD. Caesar assassinated in 1520 AD. Jesus being born around 1562. And finally, Constantinople being founded 1869, which is a good 350 years after the Muslims took control of it. And the ancient Olympics was continuing until 1956, or up till then, when the new Olympics was pretty much recommended in 1896 that we should continue on. So the time here does push it a little bit far into the future for us to really say we can accept this. There are definitely problems with a shift of that far. So Fomenko decided to use TurboSky to find his solution. And the eclipse triad that he found was the 22nd of August, 1039 AD, the 9th of April, 1046 AD, and the 15th of September at 1057 AD. So looking at what these look like, first thing we notice is that Fomenko's eclipse is annular. And it doesn't really cross across Greece very well. So if we were anywhere in Greece looking at it, we see it's less than 70% in the north. Moving as far south as we could, it could be 3/4 covered. With that, you're not going to see the stars. So this one does appear to have a slight problem. Looking at the orrery, we can watch it go across, and it's really not covering as much as it should. The second eclipse passes through the south, and from Greece, we can see that, it's about half eclipsed. So this one, no real problem with that. We can watch it go across in the orrery, and it's definitely a partial eclipse seen from that location. Again, the lunar eclipse was only a partial, cutting off just about half. From the orrery, we can see that the Earth crosses apart and definitely gives us an eclipse. How full is a matter of debate. So the effects that this would have on the timeline is basically a shift of 1469 years, meaning the Exodus would be in 19 AD. The first Olympiad started in 693 AD. Xerxes was in power in 984 AD. The truce violation occurred in 1024 AD. Caesar is being assassinated in 1425 AD. Jesus born around 1469 AD. Constantinople founded only 300 years after, or 200 years after it fell in 1775. And the last reference to the Olympic Games was about 35 years before they reinstated the new games. So I've looked through many of those eclipses, wrote some programs to actually mine the data for it, and I found a solution. So my solution is the 19th of July, 418 AD, the 29th of August in 425 AD. Now, in Greece, this one is not a very impressive eclipse, but if you're down at the very edge of where Fomenko gave us, it covers about 1/4 of the moon. Also, this eclipse is not in March, but it is in summer, which is how I interpreted his triad. The final eclipse being the 3rd of July, 437 AD, 11 years and 10 months after the last solar eclipse. And there was also one on the 20th of January of the same year, but it's not at the year before, but it's not at the beginning of summer. And so what those look like is the first one makes a pretty nice run across the northern part of northern part of Greece and Thracia. From Athens, it wouldn't have been a total eclipse either, but definitely a total eclipse over under the path. Looking at that from the orrery, we have the moon crossing the sun. And like I said, from Athens, it also isn't a total eclipse. But if he was up in Thracia during that time, which has been hypothesized by several people, it could have been a total eclipse. The second eclipse runs over Africa. And like I said, from Greece, we've got a 2% obscurity, not really being seen. If he was actually down towards Carthage, you're going to get a little larger. Not the best evidence. This one is actually, this location here is more close to Carthage, which is inside the bounding box Fomenko gives, but really not the best. And shows that, yes, you would be able to notice an eclipse occurred, but it's kind of not in there. The total eclipse does make it across. It would be when they were leaving from Greece, they would be seeing that the moon was eclipsed as they saw it. And that one looks about like this. Nice totally lunar eclipse. So the effects of that triad would shift the timeline by 849 years. So this would mean the Exodus occurred in about 600 BC. The first Olympic Games occurred in 74 AD. Xerxes was in power in 365 AD. The truce violation occurred in 534 AD. Caesar being assassinated in 806 AD. Jesus being born in 850 AD. And Constantinople founded in 1155 AD, which would be 300 years before it was sacked, making that still possible. And the last possible reference to the Olympiad would be in 1242 AD. So there are a few other alternate solutions with minor problems that I did find. The first one would be around 1,009 year shift, having the first eclipse being the 20th of July in 540 AD. The second one occurring in the 6th of February, 547 AD. Notice the eclipse is not in March and it's not in summer. The third eclipse being the 20th of January, 558 AD, which is definitely not the beginning of summer. The other one is an 1123 year shift, and eclipse one would occur at 5th of October, 693 AD. The second eclipse on the 23rd of May, 700 AD. And the last eclipse, the lunar eclipse, occurring on the 7th of April, 711 AD, which also is not at the beginning of summer. Finally, this is a chart or table I put together that has every eclipse that was total in Greece for the first eclipse, and then moving forward, finding the next eclipses that could be available. Now, one thing I did knock out was penumbral eclipses as part of that last lunar eclipse, because I was considering them, they should definitely be full, or they should actually be a real eclipse or a partial eclipse. If it's only in not completely covered in the shadow, but only goes to part of it, then we do actually have a few more options that we can find, being those four. And so this chart here, if you're interested in looking at, is a good place to start to see all of these things. And finally, questions.
Yeah, hey, that was fantastic. And there's that delay again. It'll probably go away. While I'm waiting for anybody else that wants to post any questions in chat, I've got it right in front of me. I'd like to clarify just a thing or two, and then maybe ask you a few questions if nobody has any other questions. All right, so this has been one point of either contention or confusion that I think maybe would be great for us to clear up, and that is, all right, so in your model, what you're saying is that we are, based on your observation of eclipses, that we're close to maybe 3 decades shy of being about 1,200 years off into the future from the time of Christ. Is that fair to say?
With the solution that I'd found, that would be correct. So Jesus being born in 850, dying around 883.
Yeah.
Eusebius coming around the 1100 mark, which kind of fits into some of the other stuff that I've seen as far as earliest references.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when you look at those charts, and I'm glad that they were all on the screen for so long, because anybody can spend some time looking at them. And of course, they can go to where you have this presentation posted. Is again, like Fomenko. Okay. Fomenko puts the birth of Christ, and then it always has to be said this way, because what we're doing is we're working within a system that is using a marker as the accepted time frame, and that marker happens to be about 2,000 years ago. All guys like Fomenko is saying is that he's moving the marker, so he moved it to what we would perceive as the 13th century, 1400 something, as far as the birth of Christ. Morozov would have also moved it, but in a different way, and you have moved it. And these, of course, are all based on this issue with Thucydides' triad, where he may have been when these eclipses occurred. Because again, I think we're seeing that in Thucydides' triad is that the location of where you are when eclipses take place, specifically solar eclipses. I mean, that's really that could basically prove you a liar or not. If you were in South Africa and you said you saw a full eclipse that was only recorded due to the preciseness of the heavenly clock that we have, somebody could prove whether or not you were telling the truth based on these cycles of eclipses. Is that not correct?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
With those eclipses, if they mention their total, then you really need to be under the shadow. When
Yeah.
they're partial in one place, they can be total in the other place, and those you can then line up. But it's very difficult to find multiple references to those outside of the Middle East and Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, well, that's one thing that I've questioned too, because now the one thing I haven't even engaged in a very long time, and I've got my reasons for it, is debates concerning the model: heliocentric, geocentric, flat Earth. But the thing is, I think a lot of people that are engaging in this discussion, one thing that a lot of them will point out is that, and this is what I thought, is that the movement of the heavenly bodies can actually be made to work in any one of those models. That's what I thought. Flat Fact actually just said the marker is also based on a heliocentric model, or Earth going around the sun. Uh, do you think, in your opinion, would that marker change at all if the model was changed?
Well, if you look at the Earth-centered model that they actually used in ancient time, which was circles of circles, it's
Uh-huh.
just another representation using transforms of what's happening to the heliocentric model. And
Yeah.
there was actually no difference in the accuracy of those two models when we moved to ellipses. So when Copernicus actually came out with that, it replaced the circles of circles, but it really did not give any advantage into predicting any events. So you would see the same thing.
Okay. Yeah, that was the impression I was under. In fact, that I thought that one thing that the principal, I think, tried to beat home was the fact that these movements, if you just want to compare heliocentric to geocentrics, the movements of the heavens, whether it is the heavens moving or the earth moving, um, they're basically indistinguishable. And if I were to imagine that, excuse me, if I were to imagine that on say like a flat stationary map, planular, the thing is, I couldn't imagine the changing of these eclipses. Um, I just really couldn't imagine there being any change, even if that model was changed to that. It seems like that where things are, or where that we are told they are, continents and their orientation to each other. Although I know that there is some debate concerning continents as far as is North America and Asia still connected or not. There's seems to be a lot of mystery and debate about that. If you look at old maps, it does seem that the orientation of where things are would stay relatively static no matter what model we're talking about. I think that that's possibly more of a cartography issue. Uh,
If you're referring to the flat Earth model, I do not see how eclipses, both solar and lunar, could occur in that model. You
mhm.
might be able to have one, but you wouldn't be able to have the moon being eclipsed by the Earth's shadow. So
Right.
you need a different explanation if you're going to go to the flat side.
Right.
I haven't heard
Yeah.
that yet. Some people are more than willing to explain it, but I don't know how that could happen.
Mhm. Right. Yeah. And I don't want to get off into this because this is a completely different topic. Um, but I see what you mean. The whole point is, if we're looking at eclipses, whether they be lunar or solar, that have to be dependent upon Earth, position of Earth, moon, position of moon, and sun, etc. If they are dependent on those things, then of course they couldn't happen in a flat model. Um, and so then, like I said, that would get off into an area of debate and discussion that would pretty much, I think, side rail what we're talking about here. Um, I I did want to ask a couple of questions concerning that second part there. Now, okay, so are you saying it? I did kind of ask this last time. Basically, NASA, do they have any solid answers for even the solution they came up with after all of this? Um, I know that this was a little bit more related to the last thing, but um, are they claiming that that new model actually does answer these problems?
Which exact problems are you referring to?
Well, the ones that Newton was trying to answer in the first place, I suppose, um, because as you said, there's still an issue here, or it seems to be an issue here still with the Thucydides triad. Nobody, I guess, the establishment would say that you know, this is the answer. They would probably get behind Petavius. Um, but it doesn't sound like even you entirely agree with where Petavius Scaliger would put this. Is that correct?
If the first eclipse had to be a total eclipse where the stars came out,
Mhm.
it could not have been the eclipse of 431 BC.
Right.
So there is other issues with their model as far as the delta T that they're adding, that 4 hours and 45 minutes delay. So they're actually moving the model forward by that far because the Earth is slowing down in its rotation. Now, the
Mhm.
current time that's been accepted that we've been able to measure is the 2 milliseconds per day. So if you take that and multiply it out by the year, you're going to get close to almost a seventh of a second per year. Multiplying that out gives you a number much less than 4 hours and 45 minutes. There's papers that are written on other large bodies possibly passing through our solar system that would have disrupted our orbits, changing the orbit from a 360 day to a 365 day, and also affecting the moon. This would have occurred, from what I've seen, somewhere around 1000 BC. And Yes, so there's plenty of questions on there, and a lot of people think that they're using those ancient models right now to determine how much the Earth has been decelerating and the Moon itself been decelerating.
Okay. Excuse me. One thing I was going to say was based on your calculations. Would you say that the theory, um, like those posted by New Earth and Life Creations, of the number of old maps and documents, beginning with the I for Iosis or Jesus, the Greek Iosis, instead of a one for the thousands, because of where you have put this now, based on your best calculations up to this point. Would you say that, and I'm sure you've seen these presentations from both Sylvie and Life Creations, would you say that this theory now is far more plausible, that sort of dating, to assume that first image we see on many of those old maps is in fact an I or J for Iosis or Jesus instead of a 1 for 1,000?
It could lead to that, with that I being there. So Exogenes or Dionysius Exogenes, I believe, is the one who first started using the after the year of the Lord and put that in there. That would be, it's supposed to be 550 so years after the birth of Christ is when they started doing that, which would place it with the shift that I came up with right in the middle of the 12th century or 13th century. And so the 13th century, if you start seeing a lot of stuff written with the I and then a 5, that would basically say that occurred 200 years before we actually accept it, when they actually changed it to being 1500.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Okay.
looking at the other ones, it also would change things because it brings in the Arabic numbers at a much different time. So it's Leonardo of Pisa, also known as Fibonacci, studied in Alexandria, and basically we credit him with bringing the Arabic numbers to Europe, and that would have been in 1050.
Uh-huh.
And he created several different textbooks, which were copied all over, and Arabic math started. Now, if Arabic math, there's been some people claiming that because books have actually been proven to be forgeries because they use Arabic numbers before they should have been allowed. So if we actually now have books using Arabic numbers saying it's 600 or 700 years after the birth of Christ, that now actually becomes possible and no longer is a forgery, but was actually written in the 14th century. And
Mm-hmm.
so a lot of those would need to be looked at and reevaluated.
Yeah, that's great. Um, I'm just checking real quick the chat. I had a few things that came up. Um, let's see. I want to see if I understand real quick here. Flat fact. What if the biblical model? Oh, I think he meant to say, what of the biblical model 360 days? Um, the calendar, the calendar the West uses, is not the only one. We're not left in the dark. He said the stars or constellation equal 1 year? Question mark. Um, can you field that?
Well, so the only thing I've seen about the 360 days is that a large object passed through our solar system and affected our orbit. The ancient Egyptians, when they had a 360-year day, basically had 12 months of 30 days, and then they had a festival period that lasted until Sirius was actually seen on the horizon. And so those extra days were intercalary days. That doesn't mean we actually had a 360-day year. I have yet to find something that actually says we definitely had a 360-day year in the history thing. I think it's just a misinterpretation. In everything I've seen so far of Scaliger, going back to the ancient times, nobody used a year of 360 days that he's documented.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. um, in fact, there are a number of portions in the Bible, specifically Chronicles and Leviticus, where you can find the Levitical cycles talked about. Now, as far as filler besides those, I don't know 100%. But as you said, it doesn't seem that we have any records that would lead us to believe that the heavenly bodies have been moving in any way different at all since time immemorial recorded history. Is that correct?
So far, there has only been the possibility that the rotation of the Earth or the moon has been slowing down by a very, very small amount. You'd be measured over geological periods. And with what we have, the stars movement, you're going to move less than basically a minute over those times. And the moon itself, like I said, has only been slowing down by a very small amount, which means our equations, for the most part, still work.
Okay.
Back to recorded history.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. One thing I would say it's at least worth it just to make your mind work a bit is looking at all of the various charts that Fomenko, and I think I want to say it was Nosovsky that actually helped with a number of various chronological chartings. Honestly, even if you don't feel like agreeing with any of the information in there, it's definitely challenging to the mind what he's produced. And that's just one book I'm talking about. He's produced how many now in that series?
Well, there's 7 in history, fiction, or science, and then they've released something around 100 books since the late 90s.
Jeez.
That covers all of their things. A lot of it's still in Russian, but more and more is getting converted over into English so they can sell their books.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because their publisher they're not a big publisher. It's I looked into their publisher. I always look into people's publishers, especially if there's somebody who I kind of worry about, because one of the first worries I had concerning what Fomenko was positing was that, first off, he's Russian. And I know that there's this idea that the Soviet Union fell and that somehow that extracted the powers that have ran that place since the October Revolution, and it did not. It was, as far as I'm concerned, it was all optics. So, when you got a professor of Moscow University, you just want to know, who is this person, where are they coming from, and what's the atmosphere like over there? Is it like the atmosphere is over here? In the United States and a number of British satellite countries like Canada, or you're in Australia, correct? Australia.
Yep.
The academia in countries like this are ruled over pretty heavily. People are typically expected to toe the status quo party line. And I'm not 100% sure how the atmosphere is in Russia. I know that I have heard reports that when Russia was still heavily under Soviet rule, Fomenko was, I'm told, at one point in time, was considered somebody very radical and not to be proliferated around the Soviet Union. And of course, in his predecessor, Morozov, he was doing a lot of his work before the Bolsheviks had really come into control. And then even when they did, I guess it would be 1913, it took them some years to really organize, because it was just an insane free-for-all, the October Revolution, everything that followed. So, I was a little bit concerned because Karl Marx, um, who of course they would credit for being the philosophical basis for Bolshevism, the communism, and the Soviet Union being the center of that. He said that one of the chief things that communism has to do to take over the world was to rewrite history. The only thing is with, say, Fomenko, he really goes out there on some things. I mean, he shoots the moon hard uh, on certain issues. Other ones he seems far more conservative on. But so I guess what I'm getting at is, what sort of weight is there uh, to either the Scaliger Petavius or Fomenko or Morozov dates uh, of the birth of Christ? Is there any based on sheer volume of evidence, or does this really come down to a he said, she said, and you pick the chronology that suits your model kind of situation?
A lot of his stuff seems to be related to John Hardaween's, and the fact that he's claimed most of the Christian fathers' writings were either forgeries or much later than it was actually represented in the modern history.
Yeah.
So many of Fomenko's articles before the 90s were only published in scientific journals and were peer reviewed. In the 90s, after communism fell, he then started publishing more. And in the late 90s, they had a conference in Russia to basically settle the new chronology debate once and for all. So they had several people presenting why Fomenko was wrong with many of his arguments. And the rest of the scientific community appeared to just drop it at that. If you go to chronology.org, which is Fomenko's website where you can find all the books online, you'll see his responses to that conference in the late 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And he was ready for part two to come back for them to say, why did you say all of this? And it just never happened, which is when Fomenko started really publishing books rather heavily. I disagree with many of the conclusions that Fomenko comes to, but a lot of the evidence that he brings to light does not fit our current chronology.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say I agree, flat fact. The amassing of dates and events is really great work as far as Fomenko is concerned. We actually had a bit of a conversation via just Skype text recently, where I was telling you that one of the biggest offenses to me, given the fact that I spend most of my time trying to figure out exactly what the language of Hebrew is without the Masoretic added Nakud, and it's a really big job. And I do tend to get really offended by a number of the Masoretic Jewish playing about with the text. They, and that's even before you get into Talmudic writings. But there have been a number of areas wherein he was providing translations to either New Testament or Old Testament. And, the Old Testament I can speak on far better than the New. You said that there was actually probably a very good reason why both he and Morozov would be providing translations that to me would seem very, very odd. Do you want to talk about that? Because I had no idea that this was the case, and maybe I'm just ignorant on this.
I would say that for the most part, the Orthodox Church would have brought over a Greek version of the Bible, and that Greek version in, I believe, the 14 or 1500s was then translated into Russian. And so they'd be, first of all, getting the Masoretic converted into Greek, which is then converted into Russian. And so you'd have quite a few problems with the translation going from several different sources.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if Fomenko actually understands Hebrew or reads Hebrew. I haven't seen anything about that, but
Mm-hmm.
I do believe that he reads Greek. So it
Yeah.
could be it was his own translation from the Greek Bibles into his Russian, which then is translated into English in the version that we read.
Do you think Russian, the Russian language, in any way resembles Greek?
Oh, very much. It's
Yeah.
definitely a derivative of Greek. So Cyril of where was it? It's Syria, I believe. I
Mm-hmm.
believe his name was Cyril. I was thinking Cyril of Alexandria, but there's another Cyril that supposedly in the 1200s came up with the first version of the Cyrillic script,
Mm-hmm.
hence named after him.
Yeah.
And that shares quite a bit from Greek.
That's interesting. See, I come up with most of my theories independent of a lot of these things, and I just pretty much have to sit on them and see what other evidence might pop up or not. So I find it interesting that you said that there seems to be a lot of similarities to it because of who I'm starting to place as far as earliest nations. Um, there seems to be a direct lineage from Greece to Russia, as far as what I've found biblically. So, but if I got you right from your statement a few minutes ago, you're saying that, and I thought I understood this as well because for a couple of years I had spent mostly just reading on histories and church fathers and histories according to church fathers and Scaliger Petavius and uh, most of the body of work, the material that chronologists that agree with Scaliger Petavius, most of the bodies of work that they would point to, then you're saying, were early church father writings, the apostolic fathers, church fathers, Eusebius. This is all seems to be all coming from uh, I guess what we would call the Catholic Church, even though at the time of the Apostolic Fathers and Church Fathers, it wasn't particularly a Catholic Church or universal church, wouldn't seem. Is that correct, though? I mean, that's what it all revolves around, correct? These
The only
writings from
books that
these.
we have that cover the period of time from about 500 AD to 1300 AD are the fathers, the Christian fathers.
That's
So
it,
those
huh?
are the only books that we have in Europe that cover that. The
Correct.
Arabic writings pretty much pick up in around 850,
Mhm.
but there is very little reference to anything Christian. There is a reference to Jesus in the Quran.
Yeah.
Now, I'm currently at the section where we're talking the Hijri calendar system inside Scaliger. And right now he's saying there's problems placing it inside Muhammad's life of
Mhm.
63 years, where those dates fall. We have to move that 200 years forward in order for it to actually land on the correct weekday. So I'm still investigating that side in the translation to see
Yeah.
where all of that comes from.
Yeah.
The other documents that they say they have, there is no chain of evidence that actually leads back to it. All of the originals are gone. The Benedictine monks, when they were translating it, corrected any of the events that they saw were absolutely wrong to make sure that everybody would have the right information in the future.
Mm. Hey, thank you. um, so and I don't know. I guess anybody can feel any way they want to about this statement, but one of my biggest issues with it, and I even said this on the last video. First off, there should be some advancement in people's understanding of the Bible from the so-called church fathers in the first few centuries AD, as we believe them to be today. There should have been some sort of progression in their understanding of scriptures and doctrine from 200-300 AD to about 1400-1500 AD, and there seems to be none. Um, and one of my biggest problems with that is in all the writings that I've seen, whether they be called the Apostolic Fathers, Church Fathers, the Didache, Luther, Calvin, these people, as far as I'm concerned, all seem to share this same Hellenistic perspective and point of view on New Testament writings, which all seem to be, in my opinion, again, uh, based on a Greek translation. Um, and of course, I don't believe that it was originally written in Greek, the New Testament. Again, opinions, these are things that could be debated about. I'm not saying I have any definitive proof right now. But the thing that I think is striking is the lack of progression. You made that point to me concerning Latin and its lack of progression over how many years? 1,000?
There's new words that have been added into the Latin language, which showed up in the Middle Ages. But before that and the ancient Latin, there's very little change in the structure of the language. With the actual ancient Greek texts, you see the same thing. The ancient Greek didn't seem to change much between 300 BC and 1300 AD. In that, it was just pretty much a static language. And it then evolved into today's language, which is completely different as far as how all of the vowels are actually sound. Your accents are different when they do it. The pronunciation, as far as what I've seen, is completely different from the actual ancient text.
Yeah.
With Latin, you had several different Romance languages that came off of it. You've got the Italian, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the French. With all of those, you can see progressions from their earliest period changing up until the latest one.
Yeah.
With Latin, though, there really is no change unless it was actually what turned into Italian. I only recently, after talking to one of my coworkers who's from Italy, found out that Italian is not the language that they'd speak in their village. It's used if you need to communicate with other parts of Italy. In their own villages, everybody has their own language that is not Latin, which would explain why, if you were doing that, why it didn't change much, but still Italian has changed quite dramatically from that.
Most languages seem to. Even all right, Hebrew. By the time of Judges, I think it's Judges chapter 6, there's the Shibboleth Bridge incident where half of the tribes staying in a different geographical location were already pronouncing their so-called shins as what they call today the sin. So they told them, say shibboleth, and if they said sibboleth, they killed them. So I mean, right there we can see that they do change dialects. I don't speak the same way as somebody from England or Australia or even Canada. So that's something that you just kind of expect to see, I guess, in time, is that if you want to call it a progression, sometimes it's a regression of language. It is interesting that both Latin and Greek managed to survive that long without any significant changes. Very interesting.
Being a scientific language, I think, may have be an argument for that, as the fact that nobody spoke it, but it was still used as the scientific language for writing everything.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I could definitely see factors that could keep a language static, for sure. And yeah, what it seems like is groups of people definitely seem like as soon as you get a group of people isolated from something central, they do tend to, probably the right word is to regress, in their language. If there is something that can actually keep a certain language static, I could see it staying static for a really long time. But yeah, I suppose that's just one of those factors that will have to be added to the preponderance of evidence you come up with. So I know we're getting a little bit long and a little bit late for my blood, but I want to thank you for coming on, and I'd like, if you would, um, it, to talk a little bit about what it is you will be doing next time, because we've already talked about this, because I'm really interested in hearing more about chronology and Scaliger and some of the things that have been said about him, because they seem like they may be misleading, and it kind of seems like we've been misled about maybe a lot of things. Do you want to say a little bit about that? And I'm going to check the chat and see if there's any questions I've missed.
Okay, so the things I was thinking about going over next was covering what Scaliger actually said in his first book. His first book is pretty much the undeniable facts of things that have come down to us from the past. So basing everything around the Olympiad, the Olympic cycle, because many different calendars have references to the Olympiad. So going over that was one thing, which is the solid stuff. Once we move into book 2, these are the reasons why people thought things were different. And that's where he starts to place a lot of the Christian texts. And in a lot of that, he explains exactly how you need to use different cycles, depending on which calendar system they use, to find the right period in his Julian period of where they should fit. Knowing that something happened before. This cycle may be a 214-year cycle, and it needs to start on a Wednesday. So he then picks it up and says, okay, well, we can start it here, we can start it here, we can start it here. And after saying that and describing that very well, he says, we're going to start it here, but we're going to have to move these dates off by 2 days. Which is the whole thing. He said you can move it forward and it changes the day the weekday it's going to start. But he says these authors in the past were wrong. Philo of Alexandria was wrong because he picked this date the wrong day. It wasn't actually a Tuesday, it was a Thursday.
Yeah.
So the first one that's kind of important is actually building up that framework of everything that he covers in that first book that references the Olympiad calendar and how that actually keeps everything together. And he uses that to tie in Persian history. He uses that to tie in the Egyptian history and even some of the other Western Europe records that come from that period.
Well, that sounds really exciting to me, and I'm sure I'm going to understand that a lot better than astronomy. So I can't wait. I checked the chat, and it looks like there's no other questions. And I think this has been really fantastic. I'm glad you joined me. Thank you for putting together that outline. I thought it was really enlightening. I liked the conversation. So as soon as we can get everything figured out for that next presentation on Scaliger and these chronologies, I'll post it up. What will probably happen is that actual event will then be erased about an hour before the event, and we will actually do the event in this format so that we don't have so many problems. But I wanted to thank everybody for joining us, and thank you again, Chip, for doing this, and I look forward to it next time.
All right, John, thank you for having me on. Look forward to it next time.
All right. Good night, everybody.